Hello, this is Samuel with Kieran Crouch and Justin Miller, and we're talking about tidal marshes today. In this episode, we'll be talking about what a tidal marsh is, the species that play important roles, and the conservation impacts against it. Tidal marshes, a fragile ecosystem. It's really all affected by the water levels and them rising and lowering. It has sort of a set.
Usually they have about on either side. If we're on the Gulf Coast, they have a diurnal pattern where it's high tide, low tide only one time a year for 12 hours. But if you're on the East Coast, there's a semi-diurnal, which you have four total periods of too high, too low from there.
True. And that really just segues into the types of animals and plants that can and can't live there, right? Because there's probably a lot of animals that are able to live there when there's no water at all.
Oh, yeah.
But once that water comes in, they're gone.
Yeah, so there's things like crown conchs or main predators that are like periwinkle snails and like you got things like deers and all that. But things like fiddler crabs, they can live in both the high and low tide periods. They can live both on land and in the water.
So kind of life there is more, it's not black and white, it's like a spectrum.
No, it's not black and white. It really is gray because it really comes down to the tidals.
And Kieran, I know you did birds.
Mm-hmm.
Did you any interesting bird facts that you got for me?
Well, I mean, while we're going on kind of some animals live in like the low tide, high tide. I mean, there's a lot of birds that kind of have like a variety of where they can live. Like some of them only exist in like the salt marshes, but most of the birds that we have here can kind of go between freshwater and saltwater, so they kind of have options.
They got options.
They got some good options.
Everybody likes options. Now, like with these birds, like do you know anything about their migration patterns? Like, do they go high to the neotropic zone, or do they stay just within that? That's a total like ballpark question. You could just totally give me like just theory on it, like what you think personally.
I mean, I know there's a lot of birds that stay in Florida because we don't really have like major fluctuations in temperature, and there's a lot of birds that come from up north and come down here for like summer and spring and then leave again. But I don't know about specific ones that are.
Okay. I got you. Now, I think we're going to segue. So we need to really talk about like the wildlife behind it. Like how do they interact with each other?
So you can really start honestly from the ground, literally from the ground up. So you have foundation species like the smooth concord grass that almost acts like a keystone species in of itself, even though it's really not, but because it provides so much habitat, shelter, and food for things like fiddler crabs, periwinkle snails, young mullet, and things where they live in their juvenile stages like mullet or any kind of fish, and they live there. Once they start getting older, they migrate out, and they go, say, into the Gulf, or they go in the lagoon, or they go anywhere, and they do the process of their spawning.
So this is like a cradle for new life. Like
it really is. It's like the home for. It's like an umbrella species. It provides so much. You provide food for animals.
I mean, it's providing like everything for animals. I'm sure like if these animals didn't actually have this species, that they wouldn't exist.
And that's the big problem with dredging and all that. Things like smooth concord grass is getting wiped out because of all the dredging. They need that salt water. They need that water. But when you dredge and you're taking sand away, or you're pulling that water away, you're filling the sand. You're pulling the water. That grass needs part of that. It needs part of the salt.
Yeah,
it doesn't get that anymore.
It's a very fragile ecosystem from what I've seen, and it can really just be disrupted by not even just like dredging, like it could be disrupted by very small things.
It's a very, very sensitive. It doesn't have to do with human impacts. It gets affected from hurricanes, even with Ian. It can get affected with thunderstorms, anything, wind. It's
even up at my property, like we live on a tropical floodplain, and when Ian came through, it like decimated the entire area.
Yeah.
Like, and now it has to regrow and like become healthier again. which is gonna take time. But like, if it's constantly just being chopped down, like sometimes it's not coming back.
Yeah, there's like back in my hometown, because you and I are from the same place.
Yeah.
On the intercoastal, in the area called Nocatee.
Yeah, I know Nocatee.
There's a few dirt roads and gravel roads that you can take on your truck or 4x4 anything and get back there. And there are salt marshes on the intercoastal. And granted, I wasn't over there during heat season, but like I would take my dog out there just to walk, and you can see little fiddler crabs, you can see little crabs just walking around. And on the tides, on high low tide, you see they form pools, and they just form micro habitats for other species that like the crabs.
That's cool. We have those.
That need the water, because crabs can live on land, but only for a certain amount of time before they desiccate. So they need that water.
So they constantly. That's really cool how life kind of just makes like that, the little havens where they can stay for a while until it comes back. But yeah, so about these tidal zones. Where's my notes? Hold on. Oh yeah, the fish and water. We were talking about fish. We were talking about mullet. But there's a lot of fish population in those nurseries like you were talking about. Those nurseries are used for reproduction, nursing young, blah blah blah. However, over 66% of fish in the United States perform a form of migration entirely within freshwater. We want to talk about, like, there's tropical floodplains, but we could also talk about the freshwater floodplains. Yeah. And so these fish, right, 66% of these fish use these freshwater bodies. And hold on. So like there's a lot of biodiversity within these freshwater bodies as well. However, there is still there's only 34% of species like in the saltwater that will constantly use that. Yeah. So there's a lot of species that actually go from like in between freshwater and saltwater. They'll start out in freshwater, or they'll start out in saltwater. They'll grow, and then they'll actually enter the other. And now like that's kind of like segues into, if we don't have this floodplain, this area where like these small fish are growing and waiting to enter the freshwater like body, then it causes a chain reaction.
It brought a whole feedback loop in terms of up the food chain in terms of something.
Yeah, it could disrupt what happens here in Florida. It could disrupt what happens here in Florida, or what happens at the Mississippi could chain react all the way up the country.
Yeah, it affects how the food industry would be impacted, not locally, but in terms of nationally. Because if you want mullet is honestly one of the easiest fish to catch. It's very easy to catch. You know that.
Yeah.
But it's such a nutritious fish in of itself that it can be frozen, it can be packed in, and it can be sent across the country. If it gets impacted here, it just has an impact from local, state, into national level.
Oh yes, it could probably go international, because I'm sure we export. I'm sure there's some other there's some other floodplains out there too, just around the world, that are getting impacted the same way, and it could, like, we've been seeing fish population shortages globally. Like there's a lot of biodiversity going down, and it's alarming. I don't think it's a problem yet. It could be a problem, but it is definitely alarming. Story patterns. We see a lot of floodplains actually being blocked right now, like their water sources being blocked and dammed up and all that. And the issue with that is, so floodplains, when they flood, they have a lot of nutrients coming in, and when they drop those levels back down, all that nutrients just sits right there, and it's a very nutritious landform. That's why you see a lot of these plants growing there in like a mass population, because they just have so much, and that's what's really feeding like those nursery plants. So if you block that water, not only are you stopping like the nutrients coming in, you're also like destroying the keystone species that you need to like have a thriving ecosystem.
Yeah, because that also has to do part with the soil of salt marshes and tidal marshes. The soil is predominantly sandy, so water can flow through easily. But it also has a thick layer of clay. So when it's gonna be sand on the top predominantly, but then you have that hard pan clay layer, which allows for those microhabitats, because the water can infiltrate in, but it does get stuck in that clay layer. So then the water just builds on top.
Because
of
the clay is just like that. It's just that fine. Yeah, like how they filter their soil.
And it's all just due of tides. Tide brings in some more sediment, it'll get packed on, and over years, just erosion from something, from say down south, can somehow in theory, make its way up a river or down a river.
Yeah.
And it'll get dumped into a lagoon. It gets dumped into a marsh and packed and packed, and over years it hardens.
And that's kind of the problem we're seeing right now is there's a lot of urban development
Mhm.
where there's a lot of urban sprawl, especially in St. Augustine.
Yeah.
There's a lot of properties that they're filling in wetlands,
Mhm.
they're filling in the floodplains and all that, and they have to because you can't put a house on top of this soil type.
Yeah.
You can't put a house on top of this soil type.
Yeah, and you can see that even nowadays, you saw that with Hurricane Ian with Sanibel Island. It's
Oh.
a very
Yeah.
sandy type of soil
Mhm.
for the island. And they're barrier islands. They're really not meant to be inhabited because a barrier island just will move over time.
Yeah,
over geologic time.
it moves.
And when a hurricane comes,
And have you seen
Mhm.
Summer Haven?
Yeah.
Like there's a whole new river,
Yeah,
there's a whole new inlet.
Yeah.
It's crazy. But now I kind of want to move over towards like the species. Like we did fish
Yeah.
and like the interactions between it, but I do want to let Kieran talk about birds because I'm very interested to hear about like what the birds actually bring to the table. Considering like it seems as though everything is tied together. So what's their part in this ecosystem?
Well, I've mainly focused on like the effects of like two species of birds that are found like exclusively in Florida in like the salt marshes.
Mhm.
Okay.
But
So they need to live in there.
Yes. They
have to be
They
there.
can't go anywhere else.
yeah,
Why-
they live outside of Florida, but the populations that do reside in Florida exclusively
They
live.
They
in
only
it.
can reside in those marshes.
Yes.
Okay. Sick.
But
So what are those species?
it is the marsh wren and the seaside
wren.
sparrows.
Seaside sparrow. Yeah.
Yeah, their populations are considered like threatened and endangered now, and they used to up before like the 2000s. They were found in like five. You mentioned the dredging and the urban development and the storms have affected the salt marshes. There's not as much of these areas as there were before that point, so their little habitats that were already small have become even
Even
smaller.
smaller.
So now they're only found in 2 counties.
Oh.
You know what by chance?
Smaller. So now they're only found in 2 counties.
You know what by chance those counties are?
Let's see.
'Cause if you don't, I mean,
Yeah, it's totally,
It's in
totally
here somewhere.
fine. It's probably more towards the northern side, I'd say.
I guess it'd be more toward the northeastern
yeah,
side.
northeastern side.
The 5 count.
5 count?
The 5 counties that they were originally found in were Nassau, Duval, St. John's, Flagler,
Duval.
and Volusia. But after the 2000s, they're only found in Nassau.
So that's really north.
Yeah,
Yeah, that is
that's
actually
Very
pretty.
north.
That's pretty
That
north,
went
actually.
From Daytona Beach area to St. Augustine to only up in Jacksonville.
yeah.
At that point, they're just getting shoved out.
Yeah, they're
Just
just at that
getting
point. They
pushed
hit
out.
Georgia.
Might be doing better off in Georgia.
They might
to
be better off
honest.
in Georgia.
Oh.
But going off that, I mean, a big overarching predator and also keystone species are things like alligators, American alligators, which they can live both in terrestrial and the aquatic environments. They can live both in there, and they can use the sun because they're cold-blooded animals to stay warm, which they don't feed us a lot because of the metabolism, but they can provide great ecological services because they can eat. They can keep certain species in check. They want to
Oh,
eat.
they eat so much food.
Yeah,
like,
they're like the catfish of
Yeah.
the both environments.
Have you
They will eat anything.
Have you seen how big those suckers get? It's like
Yeah,
they're crazy. They get huge.
big. And
But
they-
yeah, and I mean, but their ecosystem, like
it-
I mean,
it's getting ravaged through because
yeah, I mean,
again, of urban
Florida
sprawl.
is like overdeveloped. Like it
Yeah.
is an insane amount of overdevelopment, and I don't particularly know why, because we've always had a lot of Northerners coming down. But I do think like maybe it's like COVID. Everyone was locked
Mhm.
up. They just want to come down and
Mhm.
party. Everyone's kind of been in party
Yeah.
mode. But like, there's been a lot of development.
Yeah. St. Johns County itself is the third fastest growing
Yeah.
county in the United States.
Jacksonville was rated like the top, like the
Mhm.
fastest growing city
Mhm.
of 2020.
Yeah, and things like that have impacts, both state but more localized, because then you about those dredging, about the filling and all that. Mm-hmm. But there, things like Tampa Bay has lost 40% of their marshes, Charlotte Harbor 51%, and Indian River Lagoon has lost 85%. But even though they're still localized, tidal marshes really aren't all that affected because only statewide 10%'s been lost.
Mm-hmm. So it's still like
It's still a problem. But
It's still a problem.
It's a very localized issue.
Okay.
It's a very local.
And I'm sure that's like being supplemented with like mitigation bank. Maybe people are mitigating their damage and impact.
And there's been a lot more environmental policies locally and statewide that have restricted.
Had like it was a free for all. They would they would tear it all.
They would go all through it, and they would show no things like that. They've become very, very strict about things like residential runoff into those, or things with the population that encroach on them. They do have FWC or state governments to state EPA. They do have FWC or state governments to state EPA for the most part of Florida have set up basically boundaries for developers to prevent people from encroaching on them, because then those animals like gators will make their way into residence, and that becomes a whole another issue.
Yeah, that's a whole, because having that liability of just predatory animals, especially when you have them around like families, like having like especially with the
dogs and little
dogs, kids, even like there are these constrictor snakes, the Burmese pythons coming up. I've seen videos of just like terrible stuff.
And they didn't sit back in Disney when the kid died, unfortunately, because of the gator.
Yep. And so it's coming down to like we're really encroaching on nature, and
it's in essence nature's way of fighting back against us.
And maybe there should be like a line that we don't cross with that. Maybe we should be respectful, because or else you're gonna have an 8-foot gator in your backyard.
Yeah, and there's always economic aspect of it. There's always aspects and how you can basically find the middle ground between the economic side of developers and the scientific side of trying to preserve the biodiversity in the marshes.
And you can really find that middle ground.
And you can find that middle ground.
And it'll work for everybody involved. There's a lot of sustainability, like sustainable houses. There's a lot of things you can incorporate into your house to make it more nature friendly. Unfortunately, that's all the time we got. Thank you for tuning in to our podcast, where we touched upon tidal marshes, the key species, and the difficulties they face, as well as urban sprawl in Florida. Again, my name is Sam, hoping that you're having a great rest of your day.